They moved slowly, one file at a time, pressing through undergrowth that seemed to breathe with the island. Vines clung to their sleeves and the damp heat clung to their lungs. For hours the Marines had expected nothing more dangerous than another concealed pit or a single rifleman waiting behind a fallen palm. But then the brush opened, almost reluctantly, and a shape emerged, angular, silent, asleep beneath a skin of mottled camouflage. For a moment no one spoke. They had not expected to find a tank here. A corporal stepped forward, raising the heavy barrel of his .50 caliber machine gun. He studied the mass of riveted steel as one might study an artifact. Then with a short, testing squeeze of the trigger, he sent a brief burst into the hull. The round struck with a sharp metallic crack and passed cleanly through, punching daylight out the far side. No sparks, no deflection, just perforation. The men exchanged glances. A few let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. The island had punished them in every imaginable way, yet here stood a weapon that seemed unable to punish anyone at all. As they circled it, the details revealed themselves with almost painful clarity. The armor was scarcely thick enough to stop rifle fire. The rivets, so many rivets, seemed lifted from another era, and the silhouette, once intended to project power, now felt small against the towering palms that shaded it. This was the Type 95 Hago, Japan's frontline battle tank in 1942, thin-skinned, lightly armed, and hopelessly outmatched by the demands of modern war. In this steaming, hostile landscape, the frailty of the machine felt more stark, as if the island itself rejected its presence. The Marines murmured among themselves, trying to reconcile what they saw with the enemy they had been told to fear. How does a nation choose such a vehicle as the spearpoint of its ambitions? How does it march into a global conflict with armor already eclipsed by the lessons of another decade? But the Hago's presence here carried a deeper story, one the men could not yet see. And beyond the tree line, that story was already shifting toward its next revelation. Long before it sat abandoned in the Pacific heat, the Hago was conceived in a very different world. In the years after the First World War, Japanese strategists studied Europe's armored clashes and drew an unexpected conclusion. They believed their own theaters of conflict would not mirror the vast steel offensives of the West. Instead, they imagined mobility guiding the future, light vehicles moving in concert with infantry, advancing through rough terrain where heavier machines would falter. Protection, they argued, mattered less than speed. Victory would come not from overpowering an enemy tank, but from reaching the enemy's flank before a duel ever began. It was within this doctrine that the Hago took form. In 1933, its specifications were finalized. A vehicle of barely 13 tons, built around a 37 cannon that seemed adequate against the lightly defended outposts of the Asian mainland. Its armor, in some places scarcely thicker than a soldier's helmet, was accepted as a necessary compromise. Engineers believed that a machine that could move quickly, strike suddenly, and withdraw before a counterattack would never need heavy plating. Where Western designers added steel, the Japanese removed weight. Speed, they believed, was its own form of protection. In the rolling plains of Manchuria, that belief appeared to hold. Against scattered resistance and ill-equipped opponents, the Hago performed smoothly, its mechanical simplicity an asset in the harsh climate. Commanders noted its agility, its ability to navigate broken ground, its usefulness as a fast-moving support platform. Each small success became an affirmation, and affirmation slowly hardened into certainty. Few wished to question a machine that seemed to validate pre-war assumptions about how future conflicts would unfold. But beneath these victories were weaknesses that remained unseen. Armor that had never been tested against modern anti-tank guns. A main weapon whose limitations were masked by the inadequacy of its early opponents, and a doctrine that assumed the next war would resemble the last skirmish, rather than the next catastrophe. By the late 1930s, the Hago was no longer merely a vehicle. It had become a symbol of confidence, confidence so deep it drifted toward complacency. And as Japan expanded its ambitions, that complacency was about to meet a battlefield it could no longer ignore. Japan entered the Pacific War convinced it understood the nature of its enemy. The islands that dotted the ocean seemed to promise dense jungles, narrow clearings, and infantry engagements fought at close range. In such terrain, doctrine held heavy armor would be more burden than asset. The Hago, light and quick, appeared perfectly suited for a battlefield where ambush and maneuver mattered more than steel thickness. It was a vision shaped by liar conflicts and reinforced by a belief that future wars would follow familiar patterns. Across the ocean, the United States Marine Corps prepared for something entirely different. Their planners envisioned war beginning on the shoreline itself, where the first contest would be against distance, tide, and fortification. Amphibious assaults demanded not only courage but weight, naval guns to soften resistance, tanks to break open defenses, and infantry equipped to sustain momentum once the beachhead was won. Here, firepower was not an accessory to strategy, it was the spine of it. Industrial capacity gave the Marines options, and they intended to use every one of them. Within this framework, the .50 caliber machine gun emerged as an unlikely equalizer. Originally designed to defeat aircraft and penetrate light armor, it became a fixture of American small units, mounted on vehicles, landing craft, and field positions. Its rounds carried enough velocity to pierce thin plating with unsettling ease. Against any machine reliant on speed rather than strength, the weapon offered a simple and devastating answer. When the Hago rolled into the Pacific War, it did so almost unchanged from its 1930s conception. Its designers had anticipated skirmishes with lightly armed foes. Instead, it now faced an opponent whose doctrine fused mobility with overwhelming fire support, and whose industry ensured that every rifle squad could call upon weapons once reserved for larger formations. In the first clashes, the imbalance became unmistakable. Marines approached the tank with caution, only to watch their bursts tear through the armor as though it were canvas. Surprise gave way to disbelief. Japan's assumptions, untested, unchallenged, and deeply rooted, had finally collided with American reality. And in the battles to come, that collision would grow sharper, revealing just how much a nation can misjudge the war it chooses to fight. Before its weaknesses were exposed beneath Pacific palms, the Hago experienced a period of unchallenged ascendancy. In the early 1930s, as Japan pushed deeper into Manchuria and northern China, it met opponents who possessed neither heavy weapons nor coordinated anti-armor doctrine. Infantry formations, often scattered and undersupplied, struggled to respond to a machine that could move swiftly across open terrain and deliver accurate fire from its 37 gun. In these early campaigns, the Hago behaved exactly as its designers had imagined, darting ahead, exploiting gaps, and lending momentum to infantry who had never before fought alongside armored vehicles. Each successful engagement reinforced Japan's sense that it had chosen wisely. Commanders praised the tank's mobility, its mechanical reliability, and its ability to operate in harsh climates where heavier machines might bog down or break. Reports filtered back to Tokyo celebrating its performance, creating the impression of a weapon perfectly matched to the nation's expanding ambitions. The Hago had not yet faced modern anti-tank guns or well-trained adversaries, but in the quiet confidence of early victories, few considered that an omission worth noting. There were, however, officers who attempted to raise concerns. After-action analyses described incidents in which the tank's armor buckled under concentrated rifle fire, or where the limited traverse of its small turret restricted its usefulness in close combat. Some units reported that small-caliber artillery posed a serious threat, and that the crew's visibility was dangerously restricted in complex terrain. Yet these assessments, arriving amid a chorus of praise, were filed away with little urgency. Success had become its own form of evidence, persuasive enough to drown out critique. By the late 1930s, the victory narrative had hardened. The Hago was not merely considered adequate, it was considered emblematic of Japan's approach to warfare, lean, efficient, and unburdened by the heavy armor that characterized Western designs. Procurement officials saw no reason to redesign a machine that appeared to be fulfilling its purpose. Production continued with minimal changes, and the tank was distributed across garrisons from Manchuria to the islands of the southern seas. It was a weapon frozen in time, carried forward not by innovation but by inertia. Japanese propaganda elevated the Hago further, presenting it as a symbol of national modernization. Newsreels showed it advancing through dust clouds, soldiers running in its wake, banners snapping above its turret. In these images, the tank appeared bold and decisive, a piece of cutting-edge machinery guiding Japan toward a new imperial era. Few questioned whether these visions reflected the reality of contemporary warfare. Fewer still asked how the machine would fare against an industrial power capable of producing armored vehicles by the thousands. In this glow of triumph, the tank's vulnerabilities remained hidden, eclipsed by the very success. That should have prompted scrutiny. For a time, the illusion held, sustained by battles fought on Japan's terms. But the Pacific was changing, and soon the Hago would face an enemy it had never been designed to withstand. And when that moment came, the cost of unchallenged belief would begin to reveal itself. When the Hago first confronted U.S. Marines on Guadalcanal, the meeting was almost accidental. An armored silhouette glimpsed through drifting smoke, the metallic clatter of tracks on hardened earth, a reminder that Japan still possessed tools of war unfamiliar to many of the men on the island. Yet the moment the tank advanced toward the American lines, its long-presumed strengths began to unravel. What had once seemed agile in Manchuria now appeared small and exposed beneath the vast Pacific sky. The first bursts of .50 caliber fire struck with a violence out of proportion to the weapon's size. Tracer rounds stitched across the Hago's hull, punching through its thin plates and ricocheting inside the crew compartment with lethal clarity. There was no dramatic spray of sparks, no deep metallic clang, just the unsettling immediacy of a weapon meeting armor that offered almost no resistance. Marines who had braced for a contest watched instead as the tank faltered, slowed, and came to a halt, as though surprised by the ease with which its protection had been stripped away. In later encounters, the pattern repeated. Fragmentation grenades, tossed beneath the engine deck, disabled transmissions or ignited fuel lines. Sandbag emplacements, hastily stacked and improvised, proved resistant to the Hago's 37 rounds, which shattered harmlessly against tightly packed earth. What had been adequate firepower in the 1930s no longer belonged on a battlefield shaped by American engineering and layered defenses. The tank that once symbolized speed and initiative now struggled even to impose inconvenience. Yet Japanese officers observing these engagements interpreted the failures through the lens of their doctrine. Reports spoke of misjudged terrain, poor reconnaissance, or insufficient infantry coordination. The tank, they insisted, remained sound. It was the circumstances that betrayed it. Belief, once formed, held firm. To question the Hago was to question years of planning, procurement, and institutional confidence. And so the machine was sent forward again, unchanged and still trusted, even as its battlefield lifespan shortened with every new engagement. Meanwhile, the Marines adapted quickly. Word spread through companies and regiments about the tank's vulnerabilities, the simplest methods to stop it, the angles from which its armor was most easily pierced. What began as caution became familiarity, and familiarity slid quietly into confidence. By the end of the campaign, the sight of a Hago no longer produced alarm. Instead, it elicited the same response the Marines had shown in the jungle clearing. A sharp exhale, a dry comment, the quiet knowledge that this was an enemy already defeated by design. The psychological balance shifted with remarkable speed. A weapon intended to intimidate did the opposite. It revealed its fragility so plainly that it invited contempt. And once contempt took root, the tank could no longer influence the battlefield, not through fear, not through presence, not even through surprise. But the war was widening, and new islands waited. There, the Hago would face challenges not only of firepower, but of expectation, and that reckoning was only beginning to unfold. For those who served inside the Hago, the war was measured not in sweeping maneuvers, but in inches of steel, thin, uninsulated, and vibrating with every turn of the engine. The interior was scarcely wide enough for 3 men to work without colliding. In the tropical heat, temperatures climbed until the metal walls felt like stoves, radiating through uniforms already soaked with sweat. Crews learned to fight while half-blinded by condensation and exhaustion, their bodies pressed into spaces that punished every movement. What seemed small from the outside felt even smaller within, a reminder that the machine asked more from its operators than it ever returned in protection. Training reinforced those expectations. Japanese doctrine did not emphasize survivability, it emphasized resolve. Armor was described as a tool, not a shield, and those who manned it were taught that courage compensated for every physical limitation of the vehicle. In a cultural system shaped by obedience and sacrifice, few questioned this logic. To endure discomfort was a mark of duty. To fear destruction was a failure of spirit. The contrast with American training, where protection and withdrawal were legitimate considerations, was stark. Here, endurance was not a hardship but an obligation. Yet even the most dutiful crews understood the truth their superiors seldom voiced. They knew the armor was too thin. They knew the rivets could shear inward under imp. They knew that fire, once it reached the fuel tanks, spread too quickly to outrun. Still, orders were orders. Ideology carried more weight than steel, and every battle asked them to trust a machine that could not keep faith with them in return. Survivors later described the distinct sound of .50 caliber rounds striking the hull. It was not the deep thud one might expect from heavy metal, but a sharper, brittle impact, followed by the whir of fragments shearing through the crew compartment. Some compared it to paper being torn by a blade. Others said it reminded them of cracking bamboo, only louder and far less forgiving. In many cases, the first burst was the last warning a crew ever received. When a Hago caught fire, escape was often impossible. The hatches were small, and the vehicle's cramped layout meant one wounded crewman could block the only route out. Flames raced along fuel lines, igniting lubricants and ammunition with equal speed. On several islands, Marines reported finding tanks still smoldering hours after the battle, their interiors reduced to charred remnants. For every destroyed machine, the casualty lists grew, each name a reminder that thin armor did more than fail tactically. It failed human beings who had no power to change it. Behind the tank's battlefield shortcomings lay a quieter tragedy. Machines could be rebuilt, repainted, or replaced. Men could not. And while the Hago's flaws were mechanical, the suffering they caused was profoundly human. But the war was not finished with these crews, nor with the tank that carried them. Ahead waited battles where its vulnerabilities would no longer be isolated failures. They would become defining features of the conflict itself. In the aftermath of the first clashes, the Marines began studying the Hago with the same methodical patience they applied to every new threat. Wrecked hulls were dragged to improvised firing ranges, their surfaces marked with chalk to record impact points. When .50 caliber rounds struck, the results were unmistakable. The bullets not only pierced the armor, but continued through the interior and exited cleanly on the opposite side. What had been anecdote became data, and data quickly became instruction. The Marines now possessed proof that the enemy's tank, once imagined as a powerful instrument of Japanese advance, could be undone with weapons already present in every rifle company. Within weeks, field notes circulated informally between units, then formally through updated manuals. Diagrams illustrated where the Hago was weakest: the rear engine plate thin enough to rupture under sustained fire, the turret ring vulnerable to jamming, and the commander's cupola, a raised silhouette that practically invited a well-aimed shot. These guides were not theoretical. They were distilled from experience, refined by men who had faced the tank at close range and lived to explain how. The Pacific War was still young, but already it was teaching a lesson older than any doctrine. Knowledge gained under fire spreads with remarkable speed. Necessity pushed innovation further. Flamethrowers, once heavy and awkward, became valued for their ability to neutralize tanks that resisted gunfire. Satchel charges, bundles of explosives carried by hand, were adapted for close-quarters anti-armor work. These tools were dangerous even to the Marines who used them, yet they offered a decisive answer when the terrain compressed battles into a few yards of visibility. On many islands, success depended less on the sophistication of equipment than on the ingenuity of the men forced to adapt it. The battlefield rewarded those who learned fastest. Then came the M4 Sherman. Its arrival did not merely shift the balance, it redefined it. Where the Hago relied on mobility to compensate for its fragile armor, the Sherman combined mobility with mass, protection, and firepower. Its 75 gun could shatter a Hago from ranges the Japanese tank could scarcely reply to. Its armor resisted all but the most determined attacks. To the Marines, the Sherman felt like a promise that armored warfare, when supported by industry, could be both decisive and survivable. To Hago crews, it was something else entirely, a reminder that they were now fighting a superpower whose resources dwarfed their own. Recognizing this, Japanese tankers began abandoning open terrain. They shifted to ambush tactics, hiding their vehicles beneath jungle canopies or within camouflaged revetments, hoping to strike from concealment rather than contest ground head-on. Some crews dug their tanks into the earth, using only the turret as a firing position. Others attempted to lure Sherman units into close-range traps, where the Hago's small size allowed it to vanish between trees. These adjustments showed determination, even ingenuity, yet they could not overcome the structural limitations of the machine itself. Among the Marines, personal accounts reflected a growing shift in perception. Earl. Why encounters with Japanese armor had carried an air of uncertainty, the unease of confronting a weapon whose capabilities were not yet known. But as experience accumulated, the tone changed. Stories circulated of gunners who calmly waited for the perfect shot, confident that their rounds would penetrate, of patrols who stumbled upon abandoned hoggos and treated them as curiosities rather than threats, of tank crews who viewed engagements with the hoggo not as duels, but as brief interruptions in the broader struggle for the island. The tank that once represented danger had become, in many minds, part of the landscape. Yet even in this new confidence, a deeper truth lingered. The Marines were not adapting for the sake of victory alone. They were adapting because survival required it. Every tactic refined, every weakness identified, every improvisation crafted under pressure was driven by the same elemental force. The determination to endure another day in a war where the terrain, the climate, and the enemy conspired equally against them. The pace of innovation quickened because the stakes demanded it. And as both sides adjusted to a conflict far different from the one they had envisioned, the battlefield itself became a crucible, shaping weapons, doctrines, and men with equal severity. But beyond these skirmishes lay a new phase of the campaign, one where the hoggo would be tested not just by firepower, but by a strategic reality Japan could no longer evade. For more than a year, frontline reports had moved slowly through the channels of command, softened by cautious wording and selective emphasis. But by 1943, even the most conservative summaries could no longer hide the scale of Japan's armored losses. Tanks were disappearing not in dramatic armored duels, but in single, abrupt encounters, silenced by machine gun bursts, stopped by grenades, burned out by flamethrowers. When these accounts finally reached Tokyo in their unedited form, they revealed a truth that no doctrine could disguise. The hoggo was failing everywhere it fought. Inside engineering bureaus, the reaction was swift but constrained. Designers sketched proposals for thicker armor plates, new turret shapes, and larger caliber guns capable of challenging the Allied vehicles that now dominated the Pacific. Some envisioned entirely new chassis, abandoning the light tank philosophy in favor of machines more comparable to Western designs. Yet each idea collapsed under the same pressures. Japan's war industry, strained by shortages of steel, rubber, and fuel, could not sustain radical rearmament. Shipbuilding consumed priority metals, aircraft production absorbed what remained. Armor, the very thing the hoggo most desperately needed, had become a luxury Japan could no longer afford. Time proved equally unforgiving. Allied offensives advanced faster than factories could respond. Even modest design changes required months Japan did not have, and supplying replacement parts to scattered island garrisons grew nearly impossible. And so the hoggo remained largely as it had been in 1933, its vulnerabilities preserved by the industrial limits of a nation now fighting at the edge of its capacity. As battlefield conditions worsened, the tank was pushed into roles for which it had never been intended. On some islands, hoggos participated in night attacks, silent approaches lit only by the glow of burning fuel dumps or distant artillery. In other cases, they were committed to desperate charges meant less to break American lines than to buy a few additional hours for infantry regrouping. Defensive deployments grew equally grim. Crews were ordered to bury the tanks into earthen pits, transforming them into static emplacements that could not maneuver, but could at least fire one last shot before being destroyed. The mobility that once defined the hoggo became irrelevant. Survival dictated stillness. Through it all, many officers clung to a belief older than the war itself. That spirit, courage, resolve, sacrifice, could compensate for material inferiority. This conviction, deeply rooted in military culture, shaped orders that pushed crews beyond the limits of their machines. The tank's shortcomings were acknowledged privately but rarely allowed to direct strategy. Instead, emphasis fell upon determination, as though psychological strength might thicken steel or slow incoming fire. On the ground, crews responded not with complaint but with improvisation. They bolted logs to hull sides, hoping the added mass might disrupt an armor-piercing round. Sandbags were stacked atop the engine deck, a gesture that provided more reassurance than protection. Welded steel scraps, scavenged from wrecks or abandoned equipment, were fitted around vulnerable joints. These modifications, uneven and often symbolic, were born from necessity and a quiet understanding. The tank could no longer be trusted on its own merit. Each addition was a reminder that survival depended not on design, but on ingenuity and hope. Yet the deeper truth of these makeshift defenses lay in what they revealed. A tank built on the premise of speed and surprise now relied on improvised armor to withstand the simplest threats. A doctrine grounded in mobility now accepted entrenchment as an acceptable tactic. The very philosophy that created the Hago had eroded, leaving only belief, the last resource available to those who still fought inside its thin walls. But belief alone could not change the course of the war. And as Allied pressure mounted across the Pacific, the Hago would soon face battles where even desperation offered no shelter at all. By 1944, the Pacific War had transformed into a conflict far beyond anything Japan's early planners had imagined. The islands that now marked the American advance were defended not by the lightly armed forces of the 1930s, but by U.S. divisions equipped with weapons specifically engineered to neutralize armor. Bazookas appeared in increasing numbers, their shape-charged warheads capable of tearing through steel plates many times thicker than those of the Hago. Sherman tanks rolled ashore in organized waves, their 75 guns delivering firepower that rendered light armor irrelevant. And behind every assault stood the relentless presence of naval artillery, battleships and cruisers whose shells could obliterate a dug-in tank without ever seeing it. Against this escalating tide of technology, the Hago stood unchanged, a relic of a different decade. The first encounters of this late war period confirmed what engineers in Tokyo already feared. In open terrain, Hagos ceased to be combat vehicles and became fleeting targets. A Sherman gunner required only seconds to align his sights. A bazooka team needed only a single opportunity from cover. The mismatch was so profound that many engagements resembled executions rather than battles. Tanks that once maneuvered confidently across Manchurian plains now survived only as long as it took for the Americans to notice them. When a Hago was spotted, its destruction followed so quickly that crews often had no time to return fire. This mounting evidence forced a quiet shift within Japan's armored corps. Officers, long bound by doctrine and optimism, began admitting privately what had become undeniable. The Hago was obsolete. Its armor, its gun, its structure, each belonged to a vanished era. Yet acknowledgement offered no solution. Resources were collapsing. Factories struggled to maintain output, let alone develop replacements. Ambitious prototypes sat unfinished, starved of steel and fuel. Even if new designs had existed, the shipping lanes required to deliver them to frontline islands were closing under Allied pressure. The result was a bleak calculus. The Hago could no longer win battles, yet it remained the only tank Japan could field. On Saipan, this reality became visible in the most stark and human way. As American forces advanced inland, they discovered Hagos abandoned beside roads or hidden in the brush, their engines deliberately wrecked by their own crews. Some had been drained of fuel, others had holes punched through vital components with hammers. These were not the actions of soldiers unwilling to fight. They were the decisions of men who understood that the machines entrusted to them would offer no chance of survival. Better to deny the enemy a functioning vehicle than to die inside a metal shell that no longer served its purpose. By late 1944, a new pattern emerged across increasingly desperate defensive lines. On Peleliu and Okinawa, the Hago was buried more often than it was driven. Crews dug pits deep enough to conceal the hull, leaving only the turret exposed. These static turrets were immobile, vulnerable to heavy weapons, and often destroyed before they fired a meaningful shot. Yet their deployment signaled a final admission from Japan's commanders. The tank's mobility, once its defining asset, was irrelevant in a war dominated by air and artillery. Only by anchoring it into the earth could it contribute anything at all. In these shallow graves, the Hago existed not as an armored vehicle, but as a gesture of resistance, a symbol of a doctrine that had lost all connection to the battlefield. To the Marines advancing through these islands, the tank's transformation was equally clear. Destroyed Hagos became landmarks, points of reference rather than threats. Patrols used them to orient maps, engineers used them to mark the progress of cleared ground. Children in post-war years would later climb on their rusting hulls, unaware that these relics had once been considered instruments of terror. The psychological shift was complete. Weapons meant to intimidate had become objects of curiosity, and the machine that once represented Japan's armored ambitions now stood as evidence of how far the war had moved beyond it. In this late phase of the conflict, the Hago's story became inseparable from a broader truth. War accelerates time. Technologies that seem adequate in one year become antiquated the next. Doctrines forged in earlier battles collapse under the weight of new realities. Some machines adapt to the pace, others fall behind. The Hago, born of a different world and preserved by circumstance rather than innovation, simply could not keep up. And as the Pacific Campaign approached its final islands, the tank that had once symbolized mobility now existed only as a reminder of choices made, warnings unheeded, and a war that had outgrown it entirely. When the sun rose over Batio on the morning of November 21, 1943, it revealed an island already scarred by the violence of the previous day. Smoke drifted low across the lagoon. The sand, churned by shell fire, held the imprint of Marines who had fought for every yard of ground. And somewhere within the shattered Japanese perimeter, a small group of Hago tanks waited for the moment their commanders believed would turn the battle. Tarawa was barely 2 miles long, yet every foot of it felt contested. The Japanese officers were convinced that a sharp, decisive armored counterattack could still drive the Americans back into the sea. The plan centered on the island's narrow causeways, thin strips of coral that connected defensive positions like ribs across a spine. As the Marines consolidated their foothold, the Japanese ordered several Hagos forward, instructing them to strike the American lines before the beachhead solidified. The tanks emerged from their shelters with a grinding mechanical confidence, engines straining as they moved across terrain battered by naval artillery. To their crews, the moment carried a familiar weight. Once again, they were being asked to do what doctrine insisted they could, seize initiative through speed and shock. But the Marines along the causeways were not the lightly armed opponents the Hago had once outmaneuvered. They were men who had already faced Japanese armor on Guadalcanal and learned, sometimes brutally, how little protection the tanks offered. As soon as the silhouettes appeared through the haze, riflemen shouted warnings. Machine gun crews swung their weapons into place. Bazooka teams emerged from shell holes, steadied their tubes, and waited for range. There was no panic, no confusion, only the quick, practiced movements of units that understood precisely what was coming. The first .50 caliber burst struck the lead tank with a violence that echoed across the flat island. Tracer rounds punched through its armor, exiting in a spray of dust on the far side. The tank shuddered, slowed, then lurched forward again, as though trying to carry out its mission through sheer momentum. Bazooka rounds followed, their shaped charges slicing into the thin plating and igniting the interior. Within seconds, the tank burned, black smoke curling out from the commander's hatch. The remaining Hagos pushed onward, but the causeways offered no room to maneuver and no cover to conceal their approach. Marine riflemen fired from both flanks, their bullets penetrating at shallow angles. Machine guns raked the exposed sides. A second tank erupted in flame. A third lost its track to an explosion and spun helplessly before collapsing into stillness. The Japanese crews inside had little chance. The attack, so carefully timed and fiercely intended, disintegrated before it ever reached the American positions. Officers observing the battle from hardened bunkers watched the destruction unfold with a shock that ran deeper than the moment itself. For years they had trusted the Hago, not because it was invincible, but because it had once seemed sufficient. Yet here, on an island less than 300 acres in size, the weapon they had relied upon offered nothing. It had not slowed the Americans. It had not bought time. It had not even forced a shift in Marine formations. In minutes, the tank that symbolized Japan's pre-war doctrine had been reduced to burning wreckage, scattered across a strip of coral. For the Marines, Tarawa marked something equally decisive. Before this battle, Japanese armor had carried a psychological weight inherited from earlier campaigns. It was unfamiliar, foreign, and therefore threatening. But the ease with which the Hagos were destroyed, some penetrated from every angle, others abandoned by crews who had no hope of escape, changed that perception permanently. From Tarawa onward, Japanese tanks were no longer feared. They were expected, studied, and neutralized without hesitation. The psychological advantage, once contested, now belonged entirely to the Americans. And in the sudden quiet that followed the failed counterattack, a deeper understanding settled over both sides. Breaking points in war are often imagined as thunderous, a dramatic charge, a decisive explosion, a moment that reshapes the battlefield with unmistakable force. But sometimes the true turning point arrives in silence, the silence of tanks that do not return, of weapons that fail when most needed, doctrines that no longer match the reality unfolding before them. Tarawa exposed a truth that would echo across the Pacific. And in the battles soon to come, That truth would only grow more difficult for Japan to ignore. They found the tank just after dawn, half hidden beneath a curtain of leaves the night wind had loosened from the trees. The fighting on this part of the island had ended hours earlier, leaving behind a silence too sudden to feel natural. As the Marines advanced through the undergrowth, boots sinking into damp soil, one of them stopped, stared, and motioned the others forward. There, resting awkwardly against a fallen palm, was a Japanese Hago, its camouflage netting sagging, its paint blistered, its crew long vanished. For a few seconds the men simply looked at it, unsure whether they had stumbled upon a threat or a relic. They approached cautiously, weapons raised but spirits oddly lightened by the stillness of the scene. The tank did not bear the scars of a duel. It appeared abandoned, as though its presence here had been more accident than intention. A sergeant rapped his knuckles against the hull. The sound was thin, almost hollow. One of the younger Marines stepped back, shaking his head at the fragility of the armor. It was difficult to imagine that this machine, small, lightly built, riveted like farm equipment, had ever been trusted to turn a battle. Curiosity overtook caution. A corporal mounted the tank's glacis plate and signaled for a .50 caliber test. He wanted to know whether the stories were true, that the rounds passed through these vehicles as easily as through soft wood. The gunner set his stance, steadied his breath, and fired a short, controlled burst. The effect was immediate and almost surreal. The bullets entered one side of the hull and erupted out the other, lifting cones of pale dust from the tree trunk behind it. There was no ringing impact, no echoing deflection, just a clean passage of metal through metal, as though the tank had never been armor at all. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then the laughter started, quiet at first, a release of tension rather than mockery. But within seconds it spread through the squad. The tension of previous hours, the strain of moving through dense, hostile terrain, eased in a way no order or briefing ever could. The Marines were not laughing at the enemy. They were laughing at the absurdity of a tank that could not perform the most basic task expected of armor, to protect the men inside it. In that moment, the Hago's threat dissolved entirely. Yet beneath the humor lay a deeper recognition. These Marines represented a nation whose factories produced more steel in a month than Japan could muster in a year. Their rifles, machine guns, and vehicles arrived in endless waves, supported by oil reserves and supply lines that stretched from California to the edge of Asia. The Hago, by contrast, embodied an empire trying to fight a modern war with the resources of an earlier one. What the Marines saw before them was not merely a tank. It was the material expression of a strategic imbalance, so vast it could be measured in tons of steel and gallons of fuel. The tank, stripped of menace, became a metaphor. Its rivets told a story of industry stretched beyond capacity. Its cramped turrets spoke of doctrines that clung to mobility long after mobility ceased to matter. Its armor, thin enough for a heavy machine gun to unmake, revealed the consequences of entering a global conflict underprepared and unwilling to adapt. The Marines' laughter was not cruel. It was an instinctive reaction to the gulf between expectation and reality, between what a tank should be and what this one undeniably was. Some of the men climbed onto the hull, examining the entry holes with the detached curiosity of mechanics. Others circled the wreck, noting the small details that made the Hago so different from the Shermans waiting near the beachhead. The narrow tracks, the exposed rivet heads, the diminutive gun that looked more suited to a training range than a battlefield. The comparison was inescapable. One machine reflected the industrial might of a continent. The other reflected a nation, fighting beyond the limits of its own capacity. In war, defeat rarely arrives all at once. It comes in fragments, an intercepted message, a lost ridge, a broken supply line. But humiliation can come suddenly, in a single moment when confidence evaporates and the myth of an enemy dissolves before the eyes. On this morning, that moment took the shape of a tank that could not withstand even the briefest burst of fire. The Marines moved on shortly after, leaving the Hago where it stood. It remained behind them as a silent emblem of a changing war, its empty hull reflecting a truth the conflict was making increasingly plain. And far ahead, on an island not yet reached by either side, another battle waited, one that would test not only machines but the nations that built them. By 1945, the war had shifted onto ground that allowed no illusions. On Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the last operational Hago tanks were committed not as instruments of maneuver, but as fragile pieces in a losing game of time. Japan no longer expected these vehicles to change battles. It expected them merely to delay the inevitable. Crews received orders that spoke less of victory than of obligation. Hold a crossroads for an hour, disrupt a landing for a moment, resist until resistance itself became impossible. Every assignment reflected a military strategy in collapse, one that still called on a machine designed for an earlier and far less lethal era. The final engagements unfolded with grim predictability. On Luzon, many Hagos never reached the battlefield. American aircraft, now a constant presence, located and destroyed them before they left their concealed revetments. Those that did move found themselves hunted by Shermans whose gunners could penetrate them from nearly any angle. A single exchange was often enough. One shot from a 75 gun, one plume of smoke rising from the tree line, one more tank added to the tally of what Japan could not afford to lose. The Hago's lightness, once a virtue, now made it a silhouette that could be erased with startling ease. On Iwo Jima, the situation grew even more severe. Here, mobility offered no advantage. Volcanic ash swallowed tracks, and the island's terrain forced any armored movement into predictable corridors. The few Hagos brought to the island were dug into pits as static guns, their hulls buried, their turrets peering out like relics from a prior age. These tanks never advanced. They simply waited, resigned to the role of obstacles rather than combatants. When the Marines encountered them, the engagements were swift. Satchel charges, flamethrowers, and point-blank fire ended each one with brutal efficiency. The tanks, once symbols of momentum, had become fixed markers of how far Japan's capabilities had deteriorated. Okinawa offered the final demonstration of this decline. The last Hagos on the island attempted scattered counterattacks, not to repel the American landing but to complicate it. Some were caught by naval gunfire before their engines even warmed. Others emerged from camouflaged ravines only to be destroyed by Sherman platoons that outnumbered them, outgunned them, and outlasted them in every measurable way. The crews inside fought with a resolve that defied the limitations of their machines. But resolve could not thicken armor. It could not strengthen a 37 gun. It could not rewrite the battlefield physics that determined life and death in modern war. For many of these tankers, the final moments were shaped by fatalism rather than expectation. Doctrine demanded sacrifice. Culture elevated it. To die inside a Hago became, for some, a closing affirmation of service. Yet the harshness of this end revealed more than individual bravery. It exposed the cost of a strategy that had not adapted, of a doctrine that had not evolved, of a nation that had asked its soldiers to compensate for the shortcomings of its industry. The tanks became bunkers, then traps, then coffins. And with each loss, they marked another step in Japan's strategic unraveling. American forces, meanwhile, moved past the destroyed vehicles with scarcely a pause. What had once been viewed with uncertainty was now an afterthought. Marines navigated fields littered with burned-out hulls, their presence no more threatening than abandoned cars along a roadside. The difference in power, the industrial, technological, and doctrinal gulf between the two militaries, was now absolute. The contest had shifted from struggle to inevitability. The Hago's final appearances did more than illustrate a failing weapon. They foreshadowed the surrender soon to follow. A machine that entered the war as a symbol of Japan's ambitions ended it as evidence of how thoroughly those ambitions had outpaced reality. Its destruction across the last contested islands mirrored the broader collapse of a nation unable to match the accelerating demands of modern conflict. Machines die before nations do. But in the Pacific, the interval between the two was narrowing, and the end was already drawing close. Long before the Hago burned across the Pacific, its story had already been written into the fabric of Japan's pre-war planning. The tank's thin armor, small gun, and light frame were not accidents or oversights. They were the inevitable result of decisions made by a nation balancing ambition against industrial constraint. Japan entered the 1930s with strategic goals that demanded modern weapons, yet without the steel reserves, manufacturing scale, or technological infrastructure needed to produce them in quantity. The Hago was built as lightly as it was because it had to be, but it was deployed as confidently as it was because doctrine allowed it to be. In Japan's military institutions, this disparity between capability and expectation went largely unchallenged. Pre-war theorists, observing China's fragmented defenses, convinced themselves that armored warfare in Asia would rarely involve tank-on-tank combat. Instead, mobility and infantry support would define success. This belief, reinforced by early victories, became a shield against uncomfortable questions. Why invest in heavier armor when past battles suggested none was needed? Why redesign a vehicle that seemed to perform adequately against the enemies Japan had already faced? The Hago's limitations were visible even in its prototypes, yet doctrine insisted they did not matter. What went unseen, or perhaps unacknowledged, was the scale of the nation Japan would eventually fight. From the beginning, Japan underestimated the United States not only as a military adversary, but as an industrial one. American factories produced steel by the millions of tons. Their foundries cast armor plates thicker than the entire frontal hull of a Hago. Their logistical system spanned oceans with the reliability of a production line. Japan wagered that American technological strength would not fully mobilize in time, or that the nature of Pacific warfare would neutralize American advantages. Both assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. As the war progressed, the Hago became a case study in strategic miscalculation. It illustrated how a weapon could be perfectly suited to the war a nation wished to fight, yet disastrously unprepared for the war it actually faced. Each battlefield encounter exposed a new layer of misalignment. A tank built for maneuver operating on islands too small to maneuver upon, armor meant to deter rifle fire facing machine guns that cut through it. A gun designed for early-era opponents confronting sandbag emplacements unmoved by its shells. The tank's deficiencies were not isolated flaws. They were symptoms of a larger failure to anticipate the world that industrialized warfare had created. The human cost of this oversight was felt most intensely by the crews who fought inside those thin steel walls. Thousands of tankers entered battle knowing their vehicles could not protect them. Many died in engagements where they never fired a meaningful shot. Others burned in static positions where their tanks had been ordered to serve as immobile fortifications. Their sacrifice reflected not a flaw of character, but a flaw of planning. Courage deployed in the place of equipment that should have existed, but did not. In this way, the Hago became more than a failed machine. It became an emblem of the impossible burdens placed upon the soldiers tasked with using it. Japan's broader war effort mirrored this struggle. Across the Pacific, units fought with determination disproportionate to the resources available to them. Valor was abundant, material strength was not. The Hago's presence on the battlefield made this contrast starkly visible. It showed how a nation's strategic aspirations could outpace its industrial foundations, how conviction could delay defeat but never reverse technological imbalance, and how even the bravest crews could not compensate for steel that bent before enemy fire. In the end, the Hago revealed a truth that extended far beyond its riveted armor and narrow tracks. It demonstrated that the courage of individuals, no matter how profound, cannot substitute for the hard realities of production, logistics, and modern firepower. Valor may inspire, it may endure, but it cannot stop a machine gun round, nor can it transform a light tank into a heavy one. And as the war entered its final year, this truth was becoming impossible for Japan to ignore, foreshadowing a reckoning that would arrive not in doctrine, but in the ruins left behind on every contested shore. In the years that followed the war, the Hago drew the attention of analysts who approached it not as a battlefield curiosity, but as a window into the strategic thinking that had shaped Japan's military choices. They studied its riveted armor, its compact chassis, its narrow gun mantlet, and saw more than outdated engineering. They saw a doctrine suspended in a moment that the world had already moved past. The Hago became an example of what happens when a nation's armored philosophy remains frozen while technology advances relentlessly around it. It showed how assumptions about future conflicts, left untested, can become liabilities on the day the real war begins. Cold War theorists, seeking to understand the balance between mobility and protection, found unexpected value in the Hago's failures. In classrooms and briefing halls, instructors used the tank to demonstrate the consequences of choosing speed at the expense of survivability. Mobility, they argued, mattered. But mobility without the ability to absorb a hit was merely a delay before destruction. In these early decades of nuclear tension and mechanized possibility, the lessons carved into the Hago's thin plates helped shape new ideas about the trade. Offs inherent in armored design. The tank's shortcomings, once dismissed as the quirks of an under-resourced nation, became case studies in the limits of doctrinal certainty. Veterans, meanwhile, remembered the Hago with a mixture of pity and disbelief. Those who had faced it in the Pacific often spoke of an initial confusion, how something labeled a tank could feel so fragile, how a machine meant to inspire dread could become instead a momentary break in the fighting. Their recollections were not triumphant, they were reflective. To many, the Hago symbolized an enemy forced to rely on tools inadequate to the scale of the conflict. It reminded them that courage had been present on both sides, but that the machines entrusted to Japan's tankers had not given them an equal chance to survive. In museums today, preserved Hagos sit behind polished rails or under open-air shelters, their steel faded to soft browns and greens. Visitors examining them often voice surprise at their small size, their thin armor, their almost delicate construction. Beside them, plaques detail the tank's history, its specifications, and the battles in which it fought. But the true lesson lies not in the numbers, nor in the operational record. It lies in the rapidity with which military technology eclipsed it. A machine built in 1933 was obsolete by 1942, hopeless by 1944, and by the end of the war stood as a reminder of how quickly the battlefield can render once adequate designs irrelevant. The Hago endures today not because it succeeded, but because it teaches. Across the Pacific, another artifact from the same war also gained symbolic weight, the .50 caliber machine gun. Its ability to penetrate the Hago's armor made it more than a weapon. It became an emblem of American adaptability. A gun originally designed for anti-aircraft use proved devastating against light armor, simply because Marines recognized an opportunity and adjusted tactics accordingly. This contrast, one weapon discovering new roles while another clung to outdated assumptions, captured the broader dynamic between the two militaries. Adaptation versus rigidity, innovation versus inertia. For modern planners, the Hago stands as a quiet warning. It illustrates how doctrine can drift into dogma, how early successes can mask looming vulnerabilities, and how strategic optimism can obscure material shortcomings. It shows that machines designed for one kind of war may not survive the next, and that nations unable to revise their assumptions risk repeating mistakes already etched into history. The tank's legacy is not merely technical, it is philosophical. Every battlefield artifact is a lesson waiting to be learned again. And the Hago, though outmatched in its own time, continues to speak to those willing to listen, its thin armor carrying a message far heavier than steel. In the quiet memory of the Pacific War, one scene persists with unusual clarity. A group of Marines standing in a pocket of jungle, sunlight filtering through the canopy, watching their bullets pass through the hull of a Japanese Hago as though the armor were paper. The laughter that followed was soft, almost weary, an exhale of tension after days of alertness. It was the kind of laughter that arises not from triumph, nor from cruelty, but from the sudden collapse of fear. In that moment, the tank ceased to be a threat and became instead a symbol, a reminder that even in war, reality sometimes reveals itself with surprising simplicity. Their reaction was never about the men who had served inside the Hago. Those Marines understood better than most that every tank, no matter how fragile, held human beings who had faced the same uncertainties, the same heat, the same long nights of waiting for an enemy they could not see. The laughter was directed not at Japan's soldiers, but at the imbalance between two worlds. One world was powered by factories capable of forging thousands of Shermans, aircraft, and weapons that could cross oceans. The other was stretched thin across vast imperial commitments, relying on machines conceived before the scale of modern conflict was fully understood. The Hago stood between these worlds, bearing the weight of expectations it could never meet. In this way, the tank became more than a failed machine. It became a moment of collision, belief against reality, doctrine against circumstance, courage against inevitability. Every plate of its armor reflected a decision made years earlier, a doctrine shaped by convenience, a hope that speed could substitute for steel. Every rivet spoke of a nation confident that past victories had revealed the future. And every hole punched through its hull by a .50 caliber round revealed how quickly war erases the comfort of outdated assumptions. Machines, like nations, embody the limits of their creators. The Hago captured Japan's strengths, engineering ingenuity, mechanical simplicity, resourcefulness under constraint, but it also revealed its BL. In spots, the underestimation of industrial warfare, the belief that spirit could offset material disadvantage, the conviction that doctrine could remain fixed while the world transformed. As the war widened, These blind spots became battlefields of their own. Each destroyed tank was not only a tactical loss, but a reminder that no amount of courage could reverse the direction in which history was moving. And yet the Hago did shape history, not by altering outcomes, but by clarifying them. Its presence on islands from Guadalcanal to Okinawa illustrated the accelerating divide between Japan's aspirations and its capacity to sustain them. Its failures taught American commanders what the future of armored warfare required: adaptability, firepower, and machines built to survive the changing demands of the battlefield. Its sacrifice revealed the human cost of strategic miscalculation, of doctrine resistant to change, of hope placed in equipment that could not fulfill the promises made on its behalf. In understanding the Hago, we understand a piece of the war itself. We see how technology evolves faster than belief, how nations struggle to align intention with ability, and how soldiers bear the consequences when that alignment fails. We see how a tank that never threatened the outcome of the Pacific War nevertheless illuminates its deeper truths, about industrial power, about strategic foresight, about the inescapable momentum of modern conflict. War does not simply defeat machines, it judges ideas, and the judgments it delivers are often harsher than those inflicted by any weapon. Assumptions crumble more quickly than armor, and once shattered, they do not repair. And so the story returns to that clearing in the jungle, where Marines stood beside a tank that should not have been there, watching rounds pass through as though history itself were demonstrating its verdict. They laughed once. And war taught why no one would ever laugh again.